Hello and welcome back to Earthbeat Visions, a history of the future sound of London. And today we're finally into 1994, starting with the 3D Headspace tour. BBC Radio 3 mixing it, the 9th of May 1994. After 5 months of silence, Brian Dougans and Garry Cobain reappeared in May 94 to promote their Virgin debut proper. In the weeks leading up to the release of Lifeforms, they broadcast their first ISDN transmissions. And before those was this unusual show for BBC Radio 3's experimental music programme Mixing It. It was long believed to be an ISDN transmission, but not only does it predate what is regularly referred to as their first radio performance, the 1994 Essential Mix, but the interview conducted with Robert Sandel at the start of the show refers to ISDN transmissions in the coming weeks. I asked Brian about this and he confirmed that this was simply a radio show more in the manner of the Kiss FM transmissions. So this show forms a kind of unofficial start to the 3D Headspace tour, a run of transmissions that took place between May and June 94 with a couple of later shows in September, and marked the beginning of the group making a public move away from being a band and becoming a broadcast system. This first show in the tour is a fine example of the kind of performance that was transmitted over the following weeks. The show opens with an interview, and that marks it out as being a bit different. The Dead Cities tour featured numerous interviews, but this is the only one we have from 94. Long-term fans will no doubt find most of what Garry says familiar, but it does feature some interesting snippets.
I actually think that's probably one of the most positive things you can do right now. Just not take part in the bullshit of the music industry.
Somewhat ironic for a band on a major label, but it gives an idea of their desire to subvert the industry. And that
our foremost philosophy is that we're absolute idiots, rather than pop ego mentality. I'm not interested in that. We're trying to do something new and we still haven't achieved it.
Possibly the most repeated idea from the interview is that
the rock establishment is trying to force electronic music out onto the road to try and emulate our rock brothers, and we just think that's completely naff and very hypocritical. And we're basically trying to show that there are other ideas and other ways of putting across electronic music. One of the ones that the music industry finds extremely frightening is the fact that it can be piped into the home.
It's a bold statement to start 1994, and one they would live up to and expand upon over the course of the year. It also foreshadows the rise of downloads and streaming in the 21st century, and indeed the music industry's reluctance to take them on initially. Garry also talks about the weird sort of control the band have in the studio. The interview takes place with strange effects over both Sandel's and Cobain's voices and over the top of a bed of environments, all of them totally new at this point. None of the later Kiss FM environments are present here. Once it ends, the environments seamlessly mix into Lifeforms AV from the Lifeforms video, comprised of various environments from the album, a short burst of Dead Skin Cells, and an excerpt of an otherwise unreleased and unnamed track, a wonderful ambient piece which fans have been clamouring to hear the full version of since '94. If we ever get a deluxe reissue of Lifeforms, maybe we'll get it then. Birdwings, a transmission favourite, follows. By this point, the band had moved away from throwing in chunks of Lifeforms, so Dead Skin Cells doesn't follow as per 1993. Instead, it's slowly falling backwards, the unreleased track first heard on Kiss Transmission 6. This is high on my future From the Archives wishlist. It's mostly known material for the rest of the show, opening environments from Omnipresence, Vit and Among Myselves, half of Lifeforms Path 4, part of Tired and even Mountain Goat, highlighting that track's ability to sit alongside Lifeforms material just as well as Tales of Ephedrina tracks. In terms of unreleased material, a guitar-based environment at 16 minutes is an unusual section which is possibly exclusive to this transmission. A further environment following Mountain Goat, revealed in one of the band's tracklists to be called Excellent Sunrise, is a largely synth-heavy section titled after an answer machine message from Buggy. One unique aspect of the transmission is the lack of movie dialogue samples, with only the Scanners samples during Among Myselves used. There's never been an official release of the transmission, although bizarrely the interview came packaged with the 1997 Mixing It transmission when that was released in the pod room. A good quality bootleg has circulated for many years, and the timings in the tracklist below are taken from that. The bootleg does play very slightly slower than broadcast, making the 30-minute segment run to nearly 32 and adding a touch of sluggishness to the material. ISDN BBC Radio 1 Essential Mix, 14th of May 1994. So that's going to hit a couple of million people, and it's our first ever gig. It's quite an appropriate one that we're not standing on a stage and twiddling buttons, which I think is quite a boring face of electronic music. Garry has said a lot about the ISDN tours over the years, about the concepts behind them and what they were trying to achieve. They had of course just provided the mixing at show, but this performance is the first ISDN transmission to radio, which became the band's preferred medium. They had of course provided a mix to Pete Tong's Essential Mix show only 5 months prior, but that was still a comparatively traditional DJ mix, largely built around spinning other artists' music. The 1994 3D Headspace tour was built entirely around their own material, moving further into ambient territory. The pair claim that Kiss FM didn't understand how the show was developing, and so Radio 1 took it up, according to a Melody Maker article. Which is understandable if you consider that Kiss FM was largely a dance music station, and the final 1993 transmission was almost entirely an abstract ambient soundscape. With the 90s ambient house, ambient techno movement at its commercial peak in 94, the BBC would undoubtedly have been intrigued by the possibility of the group's experimental radio shows. Indeed, almost every 94 transmission was broadcast to a BBC radio station in the UK. This helped back up one of Cobain's assertions about the format. Radio is not elitist. Everyone's got one, that's why FSOL uses it, as he told the Toronto Sun to promote a 1996 ISDN show. And not only was radio free for anyone to listen to, thus democratising the band's music, but it was also more intimate. As the ISDN liner notes famously say, we could reach people at their strongest and most vulnerable, in the home. We quickly hooked into a radio network desperate for evocative broadcasting. Journalists who wanted to watch us perform were missing the point. We were evolving a new mechanism not based on the spectacle. Virgin had of course hoped that the band would do a conventional tour on stage. Brian himself wasn't keen on this. After the Humanoid performances from the late 80s, he wasn't a fan of touring at all, and was adamant that FSOL should not go on the road. Mixing It's Robert Sandel was also employed by Virgin at the time, and had been known to pop round and try and push the band towards the stage. Clearly an alternative route was required, and fast. When ISDN was discovered as a suitable format, the future became clear. They could promote the album with a tour, but it would go straight into people's homes via radio. This was also a much more suitable format for the dense soundscapes they were creating at the time, which would have been difficult to work in a loud, crowded live space. With the idea put forward, both Garry and Brian began to realise that it would open up a new way of distributing and promoting music, and the negative was turned into a positive. The FSOL broadcast system could now develop and hopefully drag the music industry kicking and screaming along with it into a brave new world. Rob Manley then took this to Virgin, who, along with many of the radio stations, saw it as something new and exciting. An element of novelty is usually beneficial in pop music, and this was a big one. So, as the group found themselves embracing the new format and tailoring their shows to suit it, so their words were put out by Virgin's promotions team to a bewildered but curious press, who ultimately reacted positively.
For internet connection, please access the following code: FSOL, AC, FSOL, Demon, Co, UK.
The Earthbeat Central Computer advertises the band's email address for the first time. This leads into the extended transmission version of Papua New Guinea, as heard throughout '93. During the second half of the track, some abstract metallic sounds begin to appear in the mix. They are of course the Frippatronic sounds of Robert Fripp playing guitar. A rare example of the group having a well-known guest musician working with them, this collaboration is also one of the reasons the show has become so well known. Fripp of course worked with other ambient musicians in the 90s, most notably The Orb, with whom he collaborated as Fast Forward, and this helped boost both the profile of Fripp and his collaborators. Of course it wasn't all plain sailing. The story The Frippatronic Sound of London and the Big Radio, from the first ramblings of a madman zine, details the drawn-out, tedious negotiations about the legalities of working with a famous musician from a different label, as well as Brian and Garry's own anxieties about it. Most interesting, however, is this particular excerpt. He'd literally buried our template of an hour of Lifeforms, which we dubbed with samples and keyboards and mixed live with him. They developed shifty eye movements to indicate, mute the fucking thing for God's sake. There was quite a lot of that, otherwise it would have just been a wall of Frippatronics. At times the wall is definitely there, sometimes making the FSOL material almost impossible to hear. As the show goes on, you can hear the band muting Fripp, turning him up and down in the mix, throwing on their own effects and such, trying to incorporate his endless stream of guitar textures into their own, often unrelated music. Whether it's successful or not is down to the listener. At times I find it works really well, at others it just distracts from the main point of the music, FSOL. course, it might be easy to dismiss Cobain's writings as revisionism, but he said something similar to Melody Maker in '94. When we had Robert Fripp in here recently, he was winging it entirely. The problem is, when you listen with sample ears, you're really critical, because sounds don't really blow you away. Fripp took an hour getting the best possible sound out of his stack and looked up at us like a little boy, sort of, "Isn't this a great sound?" We looked at each other and thought, might be worth a 3-second sample. Of course, walls of sound aren't something the band ever really worked with. Their approach based around snippets of music and noise looped through delays and reverb, giving an ever-changing texture.
I realize that nothing we've been doing is new. We haven't been tapping into new areas of the brain. We've just been awakening the most ancient. This technology is simply a route to powers that conjurers and alchemists used centuries ago. The human race lost that knowledge, and now I'm reclaiming it through virtual reality.
The first appearance of this commonly used spoken sample from The Lawnmower Man. The Lawnmower Man, Silent Running and Apocalypse Now, at this point the key films sampled, appear regularly throughout the transmission. What we're doing now in terms of radio shows, that includes the whole history of film as well. You can go into a really bad film and you can find the most poignant speech you've ever heard, so we take that and we incorporate it into our music. Musically, the band throw in environments which will be familiar to long-term transmission listeners at this point, as well as the Lifeforms AV suite. We don't actually get a second full track until just over half hour into the show with the arrival of Dirty Shadows. This is apparently the performance the version on ISDN was taken from, advertised there as featuring Robert Fripp but with his elements stripped. Securing the rights to his appearance on the show was hard enough, and undoubtedly the difficulties in getting it properly released were just too much to take on. Which is a shame, as it's one of the times when Fripp's playing feels like an organic part of the music, him improvising around the themes of the track rather than laying down washes of sound. It's a great version and deserves to be more widely heard. If the previous year's Essential Mix had been forward-thinking, it's difficult to truly imagine what unsuspecting listeners would have made of the show in '94. Garry's description to Melody Maker was optimistic, but in hindsight probably true. I think we're teaching people to use their ears again. They sit at home and wonder, what the fuck's going on? So why be cynical? Why call it a scam? It's exciting to get 2 hours of an uncommunicative medium like Radio 1 and subvert it, bring about a change. Believe me, we've had thousands of letters from people who've heard our broadcasts and been extremely moved. After some more environments, the broadcast moves on to a still unreleased open enclosure, and then for the first time, Little Brother in its entirety, the band clearly not averse to premiering more Lifeforms material even at this point. One question is often asked of the band's transmissions, which is how live they actually are. While the overall image of the tours, and the media especially, paints them as simply being concerts on the radio, the band have always played down that side, preferring to see them as radio shows in their own right. A 1995 interview with The Independent gives an idea of the perspective. Cavorting about on stage is the Old Testament, says Brian Dougans. For our first gig, not only did we play to 1 million people, but it was really live. Robert Fripp blew speakers. It was great radio, not like some broadcasts that just sound like a live gig you're not present at. And it was free. While Garry there states it was really live, Brian's description to Melody Maker differed slightly. It was half and half live. We had ADAT sections which we'd pre-recorded, which would allow us to load up the computer sequences and fade them in. Fripp was in the corner improvising, Garry was doing his mad Axeman thing with the keyboard. It would certainly have been intriguing to see the studio, but then that wasn't really the point. The interview goes on to discuss something that doesn't appear to be present in any of the bootlegs, the moment of disconnection where, in Garry's words, Radio 1 was silent for about 1.5 minutes. Brian says, in the end we just pressed redial. If you listen to a tape of the show, you can hear each line disconnecting. It drops from full bandwidth to 15 kHz and then 7 kHz and then it's dead. I'd be curious to hear this. The only place I can really think is during Mountain Goat, which is usually missing from bootlegs. Either way, the show overall is clearly made from familiar blocks of environments that were at least partially pre-prepared. After a wall of Frippatronics that utterly obliterates the FSOL element, the first completely unheard piece finally appears just before the hour mark, Woodland. With its heavy percussion and rolling groove, the track feels like an early ISDN era piece and very different from the then still unreleased Lifeforms. Whether it's your favourite transmission or not, the 1994 Essential Mix is probably the most important show in the band's history because it saw the true beginning of their broadcast system era and defined what they wanted to be at the time, and probably gained the biggest audience of any of their ISDN transmissions. And while it may have seemed staggeringly ahead of the time to everyone else, Brian and Garry were unsatisfied and still looking further into the future. Over the two 1994 Melody Maker interviews, Cobain predicted a model that wouldn't begin to take shape for another 10 years and wouldn't really become widespread until the launch of Bandcamp and Spotify almost 15 years later. There will come a time when we can process information quicker and send it out on the internet to whoever wants it. We'll be able to do away with record companies and with the existing distribution systems which keep them in power. We'll be able to send out our whole audio-visual product straight to the consumer. At a time when the music press and some of the younger bands are trying to recreate the halcyon days of independence, we are the true indies. All this new technology is empowering people like us. And more succinctly and more presciently, these things are going to rule in the future. They'll completely blank out record companies. We can just advertise our music on the internet, which has 1 million subscribers, and send it straight to them. Somewhere out there in the multiverse, there's an alternate reality where FSOL continued on with a new album in '98, and the band helped launch the first online subscription service a couple of years later. Sadly, we have to live in this universe instead. Mountain Goat is an intriguing throwback to an earlier era, a track first broadcast 12 months earlier, before moving into the stylistically similar Cerebral. Fittingly for these guitar tracks, Fripp is cut out of the mix entirely. There follows a chunk of the show based almost entirely around previously unbroadcast material, showing the group weren't happy simply regurgitating these same pieces from previous shows. Not only do we finally hear the full version of Among Myself, after being treated to the opening environment numerous times, but also Lifeform's outtake Deep Into Your Subconscious I Slide, to be released on the Excursions in Ambience The Third Dimension compilation a month later, and a diversionary tactic unreleased until 2010. The final half hour, however, is more familiar, being structurally very similar to the fifth part of the final Kiss FM transmission. Still, with the Frippatronics presence, it has its own sound and feel. Fripp's discordant jazzy chords over Vit are a particular highlight. The show has never been officially released, largely because of the aforementioned legal issues due to Fripp's appearance. Due to the show's wide listener base and its unique approach to the Essential Mix format, it's one of the most bootleg shows in the band's history, with various versions appearing online over the years. One of the most common was a 4-part version with parts 2 and 3 presented in the wrong order. YouTube and Mixcloud now host several almost complete versions, from one of which the tracklist in the comments is taken. There are slight differences between these, so you may need to adjust your timings accordingly. The sound quality isn't great on all of them, although one of them does appear to be quite clear, but there's often radio fuzz, tape hiss and a bit of distortion. But whichever version you have, it's worth listening to as a document of a unique moment in FSOL history. ISDN Rome, 16th of May 94. Brian and Garry continued the 3D Headspace tour 2 days after the Essential Mix with a show for an unknown Italian station based in Rome. It's a rare example of the station a show was broadcast to being unknown, but the transmission's existence was only heard of when it appeared in the pod room in 2010. Unusually, the show begins with the now familiar transmission remix of Papua New Guinea. Despite being 2 years since it charted and almost 3 since it was recorded, the track was still being used in the transmissions. This is, to the best of my knowledge, the last time the track was included in such a transmission, however. It's followed by a previously unheard environment, a pensive synth piece with tribal percussion, followed by some jazz samples. The unreleased opening Closure makes its 3rd appearance in a row, followed by the Stay Spaced section of Environments Part 1, and then Little Brother, the same track order as the Essential Mix show, and undoubtedly one of the pre-recorded sections that the band put together to play while lining up the next part. Afterwards, the group move on to a long stretch of environments, most of which will be familiar to those who've followed through every transmission to this date. One of these sections did turn up on ISDN, the outro environment of a study of 6 guitars. There's a rarely heard environment featuring samples of wading birds around 31 minutes. At 33 minutes we get the unreleased Slowly Falling Backwards again, and then other than an appearance of woodland, it's back to the more familiar environments and Lifeform's material, plus the usual performance of Dirty Shadows. There's comparatively little to say about the Rome transmission in track-by-track terms, as so much of it has been heard previously, which isn't to say that it feels repetitive or unnecessary. I'd actually go so far as to say it's my favourite of all the band's ISDN performances. While the other 3D Headspace tour shows run short, or are heavily focused on ISDN material, or are buried beneath layers of Frippatronics, or in the case of the Kiss transmissions feature music by other artists, the Rome transmission is the ultimate distillation of the shows of the period. It runs as long as Lifeforms itself and feels almost like an alternate version of the album. The atmosphere of these shows is incredibly different to Lifeforms, with fewer recognisable sounds and field recordings in the environments, which are based more around weirder, even creepier sounds and numerous vocal samples. The environments are also generally far less dense and much longer, brief sounds echoing in cavernous reverbs, giving the transmission a darker and more psychedelic feel. If I was to recommend a single Lifeforms era broadcast to anyone, it would definitely be the Rome transmission by some margin. It remains my most listened to of all the group's radio performances. The transmission was released on the Pod Room in March 2010, with the walkway photo, as seen on all of these downloads, given some dramatic colouring and a rather crude use of the Extrude Photoshop filter. There are still numerous ISDN transmissions that have never been widely bootlegged, and they remain unreleased through the Pod Room as well. Due to licensing complications, it's unlikely anymore will get an official release, meaning such shows might never be heard by fans. A press release for the 3D Headspace tour announces several, including one to Downtown Radio, broadcast to Greater Belfast in the surrounding areas on the 17th of May 94, one to Sunderland station Wear FM, now known as Sun FM, on the 19th of May 94, and one transmitted to BBC-run Stoke-on-Trent station Radio Stoke on the 22nd of May. That was the last transmission before the release of Lifeforms the following day. There's also the 21st of May, with the press release mentioning a show transmitted to Bristol station Galaxy FM. However, postcards and t-shirts promoting the tour and Lifeforms stated that a show was broadcast to numerous UK stations on the same date, including Chiltern, Horizon, Northants and Severn Sound. These stations all being in a comparatively small area of the UK, stretching from the South Midlands across to the north tip of the West Country, it's possible that the shows were transmitted to one particular point and then relayed to numerous stations. It's likely that all of these shows mentioned played similar kind of material to the Rome broadcast, although, as I say, it's unlikely we'll ever know the exact contents. And that's it for this episode of Earthbeat Visions. I hope you enjoyed it. I would love to hear your comments on the ISDN transmissions, the ISDN tour, the concepts behind it. Are you one of these people who would really like to have seen FSOL on stage? They still get comments to this day on their social media saying, when are you coming to America, when are you touring the UK next and things. Or did you get fully behind the ISDN concept? Did you listen to any of these shows on broadcast? Do you have a bootleg of one of the ones that we don't have from the later May shows? I would love to hear all your comments. Please leave them below. There are also like, subscribe and share buttons down there. I will be back very soon with the next edition of Earthbeat Visions. That will be about a little known album which I think is called Lifeforms. I hope you join me then.